Relations Committee to order. I need to log in. No. All right. Then first item on the agenda is approval of the July 21, 2022 External Relations Committee meeting minutes. May I have a motion, please? Members will please vote. Rita?
I did. I seconded.
No, Rita.
I did. I moved. No, you didn't. Well, when I pressed the button.
Hey, golly.
So it's
Technical difficulties. The motion carries. The next item on the agenda is a government affairs update briefing. Ms. Kiernan, please.
Good morning, Mr. Ash, members of the board, Mr. Greenwood. I'm Colleen Kiernan, Senior Director for Government and Community Affairs. I'm here today with a brief update on general government affairs. Next slide, please. We'll cover some of the election results. We'll talk a little bit about the upcoming legislative session and federal matters. Next slide, please. We welcome several new commissioners to our jurisdictional partners, including in Fulton County, Commissioner-elect Bridget Thorne will be taking the seat that Commissioner Liz Hausman has occupied for the last many years. Commissioner-elect Dana Barrett defeated incumbent Commissioner Lee Morris in the District 3 race. We are working to get to know both of them a little bit better. And then in DeKalb County, we have replacing Commissioner Jeff Rader, Commissioner-elect Michelle Long Spears, who we were fortunate to get to know a bit on our trip to San Diego in September. We had both of the commissioners in Clayton County who were up for re-election, re-elected on November 8th. Next slide, please. Turning our attention to the upcoming legislative session, we have a lot of change here, and as Mr. Greenwood and Mr. Pond and others acknowledged yesterday, we did suffer a tremendous loss, I guess 2 weeks ago when Speaker Ralston announced he wasn't running for re-election, and then again earlier this week with his death. He was a true champion for MARTA, and I think that he will be missed not just by us, but really by everyone. So we learned yesterday that Speaker Ralston's Chief of Staff, Spiro Amburn, will be assisting the Speaker-elect John Burns going forward. So there's some continuity there, and we're working hard to continue to build the already strong relationships we have with the new leadership in the House. In the Senate, also new cast of characters in terms of leaders, but all familiar faces to us, and we feel optimistic about our relationships in the Senate and the ability for MARTA to continue to advance our partnership with the state. We also have as we know, Governor Kemp was reelected, and we've really built a strong relationship with his administration in terms of alignment on state economic development priorities. Of course, with the administration investing in the Bankhead Station, $6 million, and then subsequently in the 5 Point Station transformation to the tune of $13.8 million this last year. And so we look forward to continue to build on that. We also may have new agency leadership at CERTA, Greta, ATL. We have, of course, Heather Aquino in the interim role right now, and we will be watching for other key positions both in the office itself as well as amongst agency leaders. We will also be paying close attention to our MARTA committee. Of course, we have had a smooth ride there in recent years and hope that we can continue that trend. Next slide, please. In terms of what we're trying to accomplish at the state legislature this year, of course, we established the Georgia Transit Trust Fund out of what was House Bill 105, which was the excise fee on Uber and Lyft, which the agreement was that that 50-cent per ride fee will be dedicated to transit, which was subsequently adopted into, when the constitutional amendment passed the year after that, we now have one of the 10 trust funds that were created being the Transit Trust Fund. So projects that are on our list that we think align well with the state economic development priorities include building on our 5 Points Station Transformation Award. From this past year, we will be seeking support for the platform level rehab at 5 Points, and then also Airport Station, which, as we know, is often our front door to many people who visit in Atlanta and ride our system. Along with smart restrooms, of course, we were working to do them at every station, and that's something that we hear a lot from our friends at the state legislature, is that the station improvements is an area where I think we can find common ground. We also have the MARTA Police Department's canine facility, which our friend at the ATL, John Ravenel, said, well, that check practically writes itself because the dogs are currently housed in double-wide trailers, and his idea was to just bring them to the Capitol, and that would be an easy ask. The other piece of legislation that we will be looking to advance this year, of course, as we put the Summer Hill BRT project out to bid, we hear a lot from constituents in Atlanta about how the bus is not going to be stuck in traffic, or that the lanes will be respected since there aren't going to be barriers for them. And so in order to allow us to enforce them with cameras, both on the bus and in other places, we need to have state legislation to allow us to do that. So we have that drafted, and we are currently in conversations with GDOT to refine it. They support the policy objective, and we're just sort of working through what the process will look like for making that happen. And so that will help us going forward in terms of doing a wide-scale public education effort to make sure that the lanes for our buses that are dedicated are respected.
I feel like we've been through a couple rounds of camera enforcement in Georgia, and the traditional pattern is that we get it authorized and then people don't like that when the law is enforced, and they change the law to stop the enforcement. So good luck.
Thank you so much. We actually did develop the legislation in partnership with the city of Atlanta, and so we know that we've been talking through how that will work in the city of Atlanta, and then we've informed our other jurisdictions who have projects that are a little bit further out, but of course, anytime something seems easy and straightforward, it is not. So thank you for your well wishes, Mr. Ash. The other issues that are just sort of kind of perennial in terms of transportation, freight and logistics continue to be studied. We continue to keep our eye on that. And then kind of the newer conversation is around electric vehicles, and in terms of funding for roads and bridges, how electric vehicles don't pay a motor fuel tax. So there's sort of a broader conversation happening on the future of funding for transportation generally. So we're watching that closely as well. Next slide, please. Of course, our federal delegation, our superheroes, we will be adding a new member. Representative-elect Rich McCormick will be representing the North Fulton part of our jurisdictions. Look forward to finding him suitable attire for this picture. We continue to work. We did really well in terms of getting earmark requests with our members this year on the House side. So, of course, we were successful on the Senate side last year, getting $5 million from Senator Warnock for the Clayton O&M facility, $3.85 million from Senator Ossoff for more electric buses. The House members had put almost all of their requests in the T&I budgets, which ended up getting stripped out of the Senate. So we got the $1 million from Representative McBath for the Brookhaven Station pavers, which I know we heard a comment about earlier this week from the public, or last week. This year, there's a strong focus on safe routes to transit funding. So Congresswoman Williams, Congressman Scott, and Congressman Johnson, the three of them each requested $1 million for us to be able to add pedestrian infrastructure at high-use bus stops, mostly shelters where it is needed. So that'll include crosswalks, ADA facilities, sidewalks where they're needed. So we'll be able to go back and do, I think, many dozens if those earmarks stay in, and we expect that to pass by the end of the year in this lame duck Congress. While we've done very well with our federal discretionary grant requests this year, in terms of the $25 million for 5 Point Station transformation in the RAISE grant and a $19.3 million low and no emission grant to support additional electric buses. We have one outstanding request that we made, which is for Georgia 400 BRT. And then, of course, we partnered with the city to request a mega grant for Campbellton Road Corridor. So we anxiously await those announcements. We understand it should be by the end of this year. We are hopeful that it could be sooner. I'll be sure to give him an update. Thank you for flagging that. Next slide, please. That concludes my presentation. Happy to entertain comments or questions. Thank you.
A quick question, and Colleen, I believe there was a study committee on transportation funding, how it might change with a per mile rate and all that going. Have you followed that at all, or? That's
yes.
not part of this transit.
It's not part of the
thing,
transit trust fund. No, it doesn't have anything to do with that. That's what I was talking about with regard to the electric vehicles has been kind of where that conversation.
Yeah, the fuel tax is probably going away at some point in the future, and how do we deal with that?
Yes. So there's that side of it and sort of like what that means for transportation funding overall. And then, of course, as we add both electric vehicles to our revenue and non-revenue fleet, as well as provide charging infrastructure at our stations for our patrons, we're following that really closely.
So do you have any idea how those conversations went regarding that study group this summer?
I don't think so. Yes, I think that there is interest in exploring new. I was surprised at sort of the openness to a VMT tax, but there's not a strong recommendation, and it seems as though those ideas need to marinate a little bit more, especially with all the changes in leadership before something really a new big idea in the area of transportation is pursued, is my sense of things.
Okay, I understand there are a couple of areas in the country that are doing something like that now. Is that something you might provide us a little information on how they're doing it in other parts of the country?
I'd be delighted to.
Thank you.
Hey, Colleen, this isn't a question, it's just a comment that I appreciate all you're doing. You're like the little Energizer bunny. You look up and Colleen's there. So we appreciate you being in 50 places all at once sometimes for us especially. And I know you think that January through April is the busy time, but I think that for you, it's all 12 months. So we really appreciate what you do, and I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Hardage. It's really been a pleasure getting to work with you, and appreciate all of your relationships in North Fulton, especially, well, and everywhere, really.
Rita said it very well, but I have one question going back to the Summerhill BRT. The lane markings, don't know how that'll play out with the final design, but it seems to me that you would do something pretty dramatic to paint that lane to make it look like that you shouldn't be there if you're not a bus. I've seen it, some of these bicycle paths in town, in Midtown, where they particularly paint it and stripe it differently. So just a comment. I don't know how that'll play out.
Sure. So there will be areas in the downtown core, like part of the alignment, that will be fully painted red, where there is a lot of traffic. In other areas, my understanding is that the entire lane won't be painted red, but there will be a red stripe inside it, and it marked as a bus lane, which is what we saw when we were in Indianapolis, how the BRT with the Indigo has recently put into revenue service has been addressed. But I think in Atlanta, since the one real kind of memorable example of a bus lane that we have is on the 17th Street Bridge, and it hasn't ever, as I'm sure we all remember, that was for compliance with air quality regulations, is that why they put the bus lane there, not necessarily for the need to have a bus lane there. And so the way that motorists interact with it is often ignored and it's unclear. So it will just be part of we'll do a public education campaign as well as have an enforcement mechanism to sort of do a reset on what bus lanes mean and how to interact with them.
Yeah, hi, Colleen. I also want to say thank you because I do see you in a lot of places making things happen. Appreciate it. Are there any legislation that is under consideration or in the process to talk about a broader perspective of funding transit for the state of Georgia, particularly in the metro area?
Yes, I did hear yesterday, I had a conflict with this call, but that some of the leadership in DeKalb is looking at introducing such legislation. So I do not have the details to share with you today, but it is on my to-do list to track that down and understand what the folks in DeKalb are looking to introduce. Okay, well, great. That's very important, as you're aware. We're trying to find out how we can partner with the state in making sure that these projects get funded on a broader sense, because it's in the best public interest, and we like to see them involved in that in a larger way. So, all right, thank you. Thank you. No, it was very heartening to learn that DeKalb is really taking a leadership role in that. So thank you for flagging it, and it's a pleasure working with you. Thanks for your kind words.
Mm-hmm. Anything else from Ms. Kiernan? Thank you, Colleen.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is a media impressions update. Ms. Fisher.
Good morning, Chairman Ash, Vice Chair Scott, Mr. Greenwood, and committee members. It is a pleasure to come before you this morning to provide an overview of our media impressions from July through October. Next slide, please. Our biggest news story in July was the opening of our 5th station soccer pitch at Kensington Station, our first in DeKalb County. MARTA was mentioned 704 times, which led to a $6.5 million advertising value equivalent. 92% of the news coverage in July registered as positive or neutral in tone. Other newsworthy events in July included the advancement of BRT along the Campbellton corridor and MARTA's 11th straight year with a balanced budget. Next slide, please. In August, news that MARTA received a $25 million raise grant to transform Five Point Station was featured in and on every local media outlet and in all of our industry publications. MARTA was mentioned 951 times, equaling $16 million in advertising revenue, the highest of the quarter. 94% of the news coverage was positive or neutral. MARTA receiving an FDA Low-No grant for electric buses and our selection of a designer for the Clayton County O&M facility were the other big news stories of the month. Next slide. In September, news of the Streetcar East extension made headlines, and despite this sometime controversial topic, 96% of the news coverage in September was positive or neutral. That's a big win. MARTA was mentioned 308 times. That equaled $11 million in advertising value. Other newsworthy events in September were the end of our REACH pilot program and the Next movement, where Next Atlanta and Artbound partnered to provide a platform for artists of color to explore the effects of the pandemic and racial reckoning since the death of George Floyd. That all culminated in a big event last night at the High. Next slide, please. In October, the naming of Kali as our new general manager and CEO was the biggest news story of the month. MARTA was mentioned 506 times. That resulted in $11 million in advertising value. 95% of the news coverage in October registered as positive and neutral. We also had a lot of great TOD news in October with the completion of the Edgewood Candler Park TOD and the selection of a developer for the Bankhead TOD. Next slide. This quarter, we also saw positive news coverage of our upgraded credit rating, the solicitation for RFPs for the Arts Center TOD, and the official opening of the Lindbergh Station soccer pitch, which was delayed due to COVID. Thank you for your time today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
If not, thank you, Ms. Fisher.
You're welcome.
Is there any more business to come before the External Relations Committee today? Not, then I'll wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. This meeting is adjourned.
The Audit Committee to order. The first thing on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from July 21st, 2022. Wait just a minute, we're fixing something. Hang on. Mr. Floyd had another meeting, so he's pushing me to get this done. This meeting to order. The first item on the agenda are approval of the minutes from July 21st, 2022. Can I have a motion? And a second? And all vote, please. Our minutes are approved. The next item on the agenda is our update on our internal audit activity with the Mills Anoff. Welcome. What now? Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped Mr. Shell. I'm sorry, Brad. I did not mean to do that. We have an annual external financial audit, and he's going to give us an update, and he's with Crow. Thank you so much, and I apologize.
Sure. No problem. Thank you all. Good morning, Madam Chair and board members and Mr. Greenwood. Thank you for taking a few minutes today to go through the results of the audit. And I know a lot of times the audit's not the most exciting. I think that's the first time we've been skipped over before, but I'll try to keep it pretty brief today. So my name is Brad Shelley. I'm a partner at Crow. We are the external financial statement auditors for MARTA. With me today I have manager Catherine Brothers, and we're going to go through a few slides with you. Again, these are draft financial statements at this point, but they are ready to be finalized upon approval. Next slide, please.
All right. So I will start by going through some of our audit process and the scope of our work. Overall, our audit methodology and approach, purpose of our financial statement audit is to provide assurance over the financial statements they are presented materially correct. In the course of that, we do have to approach the risk or approach the concept of audit risk and materiality. We are continually doing risk assessments through our audit. We would have done one at the prelim initial piece of the audit to determine what areas of the audit are going to be the highest risk to really focus on those. There's also the concept of materiality and, like I said, making sure those financial statements are maybe not stated completely correctly, but materially correctly as to what the users of the financial statements might consider to be material. The audit committee role in this process is really just providing and making sure that overall there is quality in the audit, as well as ensuring that internal controls are maintained and that compliance with federal and state regulations are also followed. So as I mentioned, our audit also looks into internal controls. That includes both looking at controls on a transactional level, looking at account-specific controls, controls over financial reporting, as well as looking at the tone at the top and ensuring that overall within MARTA there is a focus on internal control, a focus to present the financial statements accurately. We also will look at both monthly and annual financial reporting. We'll go into it on another slide, but our audit has both an interim time period in which we do procedures and a year-end time in which we do procedures. During the interim, we might look at some monthly reports and then obviously circle back to annual financial reporting at the end of the audit. The financial statement and compliance audits will include the annual comprehensive financial report, as well as management's discussion and analysis. The management discussion and analysis, or the MD&A, is unaudited, and the annual comprehensive financial report, at least the basic financials, footnotes, and some of the supplementary information is audited by us. Big item here this year, there were 2 new accounting standards that were implemented by MARTA. The first one is GASB 87, which was the leases. I know we've talked about that probably at the last few meetings that we've been here for. This was definitely the largest undertaking. I know the MARTA team worked on this for quite some time, engaged with an external third party to assist with that process. And then the next standard that was adopted was GASB 87, accounting for interest costs incurred before the end of a construction period. That was also implemented, although I would say, yes, GASB 87 was definitely the largest time commitment for this year. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, and so we'll go into that a little bit. We'll have some financial highlights in a few slides, and Brad will go over how that impacted the actual financial statements, how the balances might have changed as a result of that. So yes, we will go into specifics on some numbers of what actually changed as a result of the standard. So the audit approach here, as I've said, we had an interim fieldwork time, which was in the spring, early to mid-May. At that point, we really focused on our control processes and updating our documentation, doing tests over controls, looking at processes over, how journal entries are posted, how checks are approved and cut. During that time, we also focus heavily on the uniform guidance or single audit, which is the audit over your compliance with the federal grant regulations. The year-end audit runs from mid-August through about the end of September, and this is really the time in which we're looking at those year-end balances, looking at the financial statements and testing those items. Some wrap-up areas would be, updating our internal control procedures. We also updated our uniform guidance testing to make sure that we're looking at controls and federal grant expenditures occurring throughout the entire year. And last piece of our year-end audit would be our NTD procedures, which do occur in the month of October, for that October 31st deadline there. And then the reporting phase is the last piece of the audit, which it usually runs from about late September through October and maybe into early November. At that time, we reviewed the financial statements, put together our reports, and which all led to reporting the audit committee. We're here today. All right, next slide. So the deliverables that you have from our audit are listed here on the slide. The first 3 bullet points are going to be in relation to our financial statement audit. We'll have an independent auditor's report, a management letter, and a SAS 114 letter. I will note here that the independent auditor's report will look a little different from prior years. There was a new auditing standard during the year which did update the language in the opinions. The content of it is not necessarily different, but it will look a little different and it will read a little different. But ultimately, it was a clean opinion, so it will have the same information, just presented a little bit differently. And then the management letter you have as well, that would report any significant deficiencies or material weaknesses if we had encountered any during the audit. And the SAS 114 letter has some other communications about our audit process, goes into that a little bit more detail. The middle 3 bullet points on this slide are all in relation to our federal compliance audit, the uniform guidance audit. So we've got 2 opinions over internal control over financial reporting and compliance, and then as well as a report on compliance over each major program that we test. In this case was the federal transit cluster. The opinions also include an in relation to opinion on the schedule of expenditures of federal awards. Last 2 pieces on here. One, there is a report, an agreed upon procedures report on the National Transit Database submission. So that is included as well. And then finally, we will provide an electronic certification over the data collection form after the audit is finalized, and that will be what's going to be submitted in relation to the uniform guidance audit. All right, next slide.
Yeah, and so on these next couple of slides, this just is intended to give you a high-level overview of some of the balances and transactions during the current fiscal year in comparison to the prior fiscal year. So this slide is looking at the statement of net position or your balance sheet and looking at the 3 main categories included on there: assets and deferred outflows, liabilities and deferred inflows, and then your net position, which is similar to an equity. So as you can see here, not really a lot of significant changes year over year. Assets and deferred outflows are pretty consistent, a slight increase there. Similarly, liabilities and deferred inflows, pretty consistent, a slight decrease, but no major changes there. And then you do see the net position did increase by about $250 million this year. that's a combination of things that we'll get into on the next slide. So if you want to move to the next slide. Similar concept here. We're trying to give just a very high-level overview of the statement of revenues, expenses, and changes in net position, or your income statement. And again, breaking it down into the 5 major categories. All of this you can find within the MD&A and the financial statements. That's where you can really find more of the comparative information, and you can find some of management's comments on the reasons for the increases or decreases. But as you look here, operating revenues, obviously a small part of the overall picture, but nonetheless a positive step forward in fair revenue increasing this year by about $14 million. So that's a good sign, obviously, from the transit operation standpoint. On the expenses, you see a decrease in expenses there, but not a significant change, really, as you look at that in comparison, as you're about $750 million last year, slight decrease this year. Non-operating revenues, this is where you see the most change, and really this is what's driving most of the change in the increase in the change in net position. Sales tax revenue increased about $100 million this year, and so that's really what's driving that increase there. I think it was about $569,000 the year before, up to about $669 this year, so pretty significant increase in that sales tax revenue. Capital grants, pretty consistent, and then again your change in net position up to about $250 million positive this year. And obviously through all of this, included in there in the non-operating revenues, is the additional federal grants through the CARES, CRISA, and ARPA grants. So I know that's always a widely discussed piece. That's included within there. What you're seeing is there wasn't a lot of change. You were still able to spend a lot of those dollars. You still have some of the ARPA dollars remaining for the future years as well. Along with that, before we jump into the next slide, actually, one of the things I did want to mention, there was a good question earlier about the GASB 87. Within the financial statements, if you have that open in front of you, if not, that's fine. But if you flip through to page 22, you'll see a footnote in there that describes the leases. That gives you some good information on the actual transactions there and what was changed from that. So there was about a $1.7 million increase or change in the net position as a result of that. And I'm going to pull it up here. Actually, maybe it's not page 24. Sorry, I may have quoted you the wrong page number there. So the lease footnote is actually on 42. Apparently I got those numbers turned around. So footnote 11, page 42, gives some information in there about the leases that you have. And as a reminder, this new GASB, what it did, essentially what it said was you needed to recognize assets and liabilities or deferred inflows and assets, depending on if it's a lessee situation or a lessor. So lessee meaning you're leasing something from someone else, lessor you're leasing it to someone. The bulk of your transactions from a dollar standpoint or from a lessor standpoint, as far as office space, ground leases, those types of things related to the TOD program. And so what you see in here is there was very minimal net impact. So as I mentioned, about a $1.7 million net impact at the date of implementation, which was July 1st of 2021, so the beginning of the fiscal year that we audited. When you look at the gross numbers, what you'll see is on the lessor side, there was about a $315 million gross up of assets and liabilities or deferred inflows. On the lessee side, there was about, I think it was about a $5 million impact related to that. So overall, what it's really doing is it's adding, in the case of a lessor, you have now a lease receivable on your books for that amount that you'll eventually be collecting. And then you have a deferred inflow of resources, which is representing essentially the revenue that you'll recognize in future periods. Currently, those two amounts are pretty consistent. As time goes on, there may be some differential and you may see some net impact especially in some of the longer term leases that extend out 50, 60, 70, 80 years. You may see some longer term impacts, but currently there's really no net impact. It's mostly just adding assets and liabilities to the books. That's the primary thing I wanted to cover there from a financial statement standpoint. There is a number of other, obviously, footnotes and disclosures in there, but that was really the key one this year. And as Catherine mentioned, while it looks like a pretty easy change and just add these balances on the financial statements, I think the staff and the finance and really a lot of different departments were involved from MARTA standpoint to gather all the information about all the leases, gather all the agreements that maybe even were potential leases, so that the finance team and others could assess that and determine what transaction needed to be recorded, if anything. So we roll it all up and we present it in a 30-second blurb, but it really took significantly more time from their end. Took some additional time from our end as well to complete testing and to review that. If you move on to the next slide, this is just a list of some additional information. All of this information is included within the SAS 114 or Audit Communications letter that we have a draft in there of as well. But it outlines, again, our responsibilities as auditors. Nothing has really changed there, but it just outlines what those are. We are required to communicate that we are independent from MARTA, which is obviously very important if we're issuing the independent auditor's report. Discloses any new significant accounting policies, which as this year was the GASB 87 and the implementation of the lease accounting requirements. Any significant management judgments or accounting estimates are included in there, and really what we're looking from that standpoint is related to the estimates. Do you have a consistent manner in the way that you are determining those? Do you have, are those estimates reasonable? Those types of things. So no concerns in that area. Moving down the list from auditor's judgments, if we had any concerns about the neutrality of the financial statements, if we felt like management was recording certain types of adjustments or transactions but excluding others to try to make income look better or worse, whatever the case, that would be a concern. We don't have any concerns. We did not identify anything there. We also did not have any corrected or uncorrected misstatements, so that's a positive. Those would be any audit adjustments that we proposed that we either required to be posted or were immaterial and did not have to be posted, and we did not identify any. We also did not have any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in internal controls, and no uniform guidance compliance audit findings. And again, the uniform guidance referring back to the major federal program that we tested, the Federal Transit Cluster. No other communications to share with the committee. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we always like to finish with a few of the emerging issues, which oftentimes are new accounting standards, as it seems that there are new accounting standards almost every month. And as you can see here, there's a few of them coming up in the next couple of years. The first one that's listed here, GASB 96, that's required to be implemented in this next fiscal year, actually the one that you're currently in, is related to subscription-based technology agreements. And those, in a nutshell, it's the same thing as GASB 87, but it's looking at other types of software-related, cloud-based agreements, looking at those types of agreements to, again, record a right-to-use asset, an intangible asset, for the ability to use that software. What is a little bit more of a challenge in some of these is oftentimes baked in those agreements are maintenance agreements or additional consulting or services throughout that process. So what this is looking at is, do you have a right to use a cloud? Do you have the right to use certain software or a server or whatever the case may be? That's what you're trying to record as an asset. The difficult part will be pulling out any pieces of that that is really not related to that it's ongoing maintenance or services. So that'll be a challenge. On the positive side, management has already went through the process once of going through GASB 87 with leases, and the accounting for this is exactly the same. It's just a matter of going through that process again and obtaining all those agreements and determining the calculations. The other two that are listed here don't impact or don't expect to have any significant impact. The GASB 99 just has some clarifications on leases and on the subscription-based technology arrangements I talked about, so obviously that'll be implemented at the same time. 2 years out, there's a couple of new changes or accounting standards that are out there, but again, no significant impact expected at this point in time. So that concludes our presentation, and again, happy to answer any questions that the committee or board may have.
Mr. Pond?
Thank you, Brad. I'm reflecting on your comment, and you're right, probably reporting for the audit committees, maybe not the most exciting committee meeting we have, but I was talking to Bill Floyd the other day, and quite frankly, audit committee is probably one of the most important committees and things we do.
Yeah.
But I do have one question. When you mentioned internal controls deficiencies, and they were immaterial, very minor, but share with me again, when you find these items, you put them on these reports, and then the next year, what is the follow-up to be sure that staff has taken action on these deficiencies, even though they are minor?
Yeah, so if we have anything that's minor, typically that's something that is just we verbally communicate with the accounting team, and or if it's IT related, or if it's another department that's involved, we will have some communication with them as well. And then as part of the next year's audit process, we will follow up on that to see what progress has been made, if any, and then we may have the same deficiency comment again, or we may be able to clear that comment if we see that a control has been added or process has been changed. So.
Mr. Floyd?
Oh,
I'm sorry. Mr. Floyd, or you guys pick, either order.
Yeah, I just have a question, and I'm not trying to do a deep dive into this leasing of this GASB 87. I know we've been talking about this for a few years. We knew it was coming, but my question is that when you look at these leases, have they created a template now that they've gone through and looked at all these leases and deep dive in all of those, so that as new leases come on to into existence, that you have a way of looking at all this activity, all these outstanding obligations, and agree to future expenditures in the process? Was that part of your recommendation, or was that something that was?
Actually, MARTA was already on top of that, and they you all are using a software called Lease Query. Okay. Not only are you using the software that tracks all that, but they have some contacts within Lease Query that they can reach out to if they have questions about how to record something, or how an amortization schedule is looking, or any of those types of things. So I feel pretty comfortable between using the software and having the ability to reach out to them and reach out to us if they have questions. Obviously, as new leases come on, they're always available to ask us questions from an accounting standpoint. So I think moving forward should be a much easier process. Mm-hmm. This was kind of catching up to years, all the leases that are still in existence, and trying to gather all those. As you move forward each year, that should be pretty easy to add in the handful of new leases or modifications to leases that you have.
Great. Thank you. That's what I want to know.
Yep.
Thank you.
You mentioned dollars from the CARES Act and the Relief Act and that kind of thing. Does your audit include any opinion or analysis on how MARTA has spent those dollars regarding the requirements in the law?
So we do audit those dollars. Those are all part of the federal transit cluster that we tested. We do test those for compliance with the requirements, yes. So we don't, I want to make the distinction. We don't look at those and say you're spending those in the best way or the most, but we do look at, are you spending them on allowable costs, right? Are they allowable within the regulations? And yes, we do that, and we didn't have any concerns there.
Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions? Thank you, Mr. Shell, and also Ms. Brothers. We really appreciate this update.
Thank you all.
Now, the star of the show.
Madam Chair, Mr. Greenwood, members of the MARTA board, good morning. My name is Emil Zanov, the head of internal audit. First of all, thank you for being here on a Friday before Thanksgiving week. I really appreciate the opportunity to give you a quick update on the internal audit activities for the first fiscal quarter of MARTA's fiscal 23, beginning July 1st, ending September 30th, 2022. Next slide. Beginning with the operational audit group audits, the operational audit team under Charles Middlebrooks finished 3 audit projects. I'm pretty pleased to see a fairly clean set of audits for the first quarter of fiscal 23. We completed a travel expense audit, just looking at the controls around our travel expenses, because with COVID we didn't really travel that much, but I think travel will begin to pick up again with COVID for the most part in the rear view mirror. The controls seem to be operating effectively, which is a good outcome for the agency. The second audit was of our online invoice system, ALIS. This invoicing system is used for our capital project payments. And we wanted to just kick the tires and examine the major controls around ALIS and the online invoicing systems and the payments there. There were no significant findings. There were 2 moderate risk findings and recommendations coming out of that audit. The third audit was related to the capital project soft costs and some of the controls around that. As a reminder, and I'm sure you all know what that is, but since we're on YouTube these days, soft costs relate to all the intangible costs related to a construction project. Things like, engineering fees, public outreach fees, permits, environmental studies, project management costs, or the interest on any loans that are acquired to fund a particular capital program. The interest-only cost constitutes soft cost as well. We did not find any significant control deficiencies in the process. We had 2 moderate findings and recommendations associated with those moderate risk findings. So overall, a fairly clean quarter from an operational audit perspective. Let's move to the next slide, please. These are prior operational audits with open significant findings. And I must say that one of the major ways an audit shop or an audit department adds value to an organization is the rigorous follow-up on prior findings, especially significant findings. We dedicate significant number of our audit hours, which is our currency basically, following up on whether prior findings can be fixed and corrective action plans implemented. I'm happy to say that management continues to kind of work actively to fix various different open findings. On the prior audit of non-revenue vehicles, all the 5 significant findings were closed, and management has implemented ways to institute additional controls and implement additional technology to close those findings. On the capital improvement program, we have 9 of the 28 findings that are still in various degrees of completion. We've listed them in progress because progress has been made, but in our opinion, the finish line has not been crossed just yet. As I mentioned, we put a lot of hours making sure that when we say we've crossed the finish line, we have crossed the finish line in implementing those recommendations. The third one is in bus maintenance. In the area of predictive maintenance, we have seen a lot of progress, but since the benchmark is pretty high at 95% of predictive maintenance, they're kind of getting close to that, but they haven't crossed the finish line, so we have listed that as in progress as well. And finally, in the inventory audit, the 2 significant findings, one was still being worked, but we confirmed that the appropriate adjustments were made in the bulk fluid records. So we feel like the process that has been implemented will remediate that finding going forward. So overall, we're tracking 10 in process out of the 36 significant findings, and I will continue to update this board with respect to whether those findings are closed or not, because that's a very, very important part of our work. Next slide. Moving to our IT audit domain, we finished a fairly big audit of our Oracle disaster recovery policies, procedures, and processes. We identified 3 significant findings and 2 moderate findings. We focused on Oracle because it's a mission-critical application for MARTA. Typically, I would provide details to the board as it relates to the nature of the findings, and I must ask for forgiveness here. The nature of the finding is security sensitive, and I felt it would not be wise to disclose them on YouTube because they can be misused or abused by people with malicious intent. So, they're not on this slide for that reason. We were in the stage of field work in third-party IT risk management. When we refer to third parties, we're really looking at our contracts with various different cloud service providers and how some of the controls are embedded in those contracts. Our society in general, and MARTA is no exception, we rely more and more and more, and will continue to rely more and more and more on various different cloud services. That's just the way the world of technology is going, and it will continue to go. So it was time for us to look at how well we're set up in terms of those cloud service agreements. And I will report the outcome of that audit at the next audit committee meeting. Very important audit. The third one that we kicked off just recently is in the area of identity and access management. Very important from a cybersecurity perspective. Just the way I describe it is we need to understand the controls that track people and machines of how they access MARTA's network and how they move around the network once they're inside. It's not just people, but machines also talk to other machines. We want to make sure the controls there are adequate, and if they're not, then help the IT department to improve them. Finally, the support of our critical enterprise applications. This is more of a how well our critical infrastructure is being supported on a day-to-day basis. So those are still in the planning phase of the audit. So overall, a very busy quarter for our 2 IT auditors and audit manager that we have in the department. Let's move to the next slide. These are the prior audit findings. A lot of different audits are making progress. We have 2 pen tests where we're tracking the remediation of those vulnerabilities. I'd like to draw your attention to the third line, which is the Alstom contract for the train control system and SCADA. There is one finding that is listed as process, but it's good to report that that one was closed as well. We just it was subsequent events, so it will be marked as closed at the next audit committee meeting, and then those 6 findings would have been marked all as closed. So good news there. Thank you, George. We have one past due item that we have been carrying for a while in the IT space around cybersecurity, PCs, email, and internet. We have technology that's very outdated in the environment, and we need to work to get rid of it and make sure that we're patching on a regular basis and everything gets reconciled. So that one finding will remain there until it's fixed. Next slide. Moving over to our contract audit group. Our contract audit team has been extremely busy, and we would expect that to happen because we have a very large and intense capital program here. They touched 37 and 25, 62 audit projects in one quarter, which is a huge volume of audits to be handled by an audit group of a handful of people. They completed 37 of those audits, and as we were exiting the quarter, they had 25 audits being worked on as we speak. So extremely busy quarter for my contract audit team. I have to thank them here in this forum because, I mean, they're working continuously. They don't stop. And this is, 62 audits. It's not a small number, but we do our best to support our capital program. We do what we can. So very busy quarter. Only 4 of the 37 audits needed attention. So that's good news. In the audit types that were worked, 1 was interim or closeout. 17, these are most of the audits that we do are rate reviews. 3 were cost price analysis, and 4 were change orders. So overall, very busy. Let's move to the next slide. Finally, the
Madam
fraud.
Chair, can I jump in and ask a question? Could you go back to the prior slide? The last line identified unsupported cost price and
Right.
change order views, 12 million
Right.
plus dollars. Could you explain what's going on there, where that's?
Yes, I'll be happy to. So when we look at proposals for rates and overhead rates going forward, companies that sign contract with MARTA, we want to see support for their cost. For example, if they're going to charge us for Jane Doe or Joe Doe engineer, we want to see that when they charge us $100 an hour and 1.7, 170% overhead rate, that $100 an hour is supported with a payroll register, and the overhead rate is supported. And the vast majority of cases, our consultants are able to support those costs, but in some cases, they're not. And some of the large projects that can happen, whether they're estimates or they're just kind of something that's anticipated to happen, but there's no support behind it. We examined that support documentation, and in this particular quarter, there were $12 million, approximately 12 and a half, that there was, these were placeholders essentially, but there's no support to say, we'll charge you this much for this position.
So the follow-up is you go back to the vendors and require them to provide the documentation that the charges are appropriate.
Correct.
And there are a number of those that task hasn't been completed yet.
Typically it's some position. It's not the entire contract, but typically they may have put a placeholder there for some work that they may anticipate doing, in the following year, but they don't know who will do the work or how much that will cost them.
Right. But the end result would be a much smaller number, like that $752,000.
Right, and the $752,000. Yes, the $12 million will hopefully be reduced to zero, because we want to have support, and we do have support with timesheets during the actual billing process. Okay. But we want to make sure we have those controls and discipline so things don't fall through the cracks. Okay. The 752 are overhead rate reviews. We review the overhead rates according to FAR, and sometimes companies have to have expenses that are business needed, but they're not compliant with FAR. And FAR have specific prescriptions as to what's allowable and what's not. And we review those, and when those costs are not allowable, we'll have to take them out of the overhead rate. I mean, that's just kind of how it is.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to the next slide. This is a fraud investigation summary. The first section, previously reported investigations. We closed all 3 previously reported investigations during the quarter. The first one was closed because the individual that was implicated in the investigation left the authority on their own accord, and we could not complete the investigation. There was no indication of any sort of criminal activity or anything like that, and therefore we closed that investigation. The next 2 investigations, those investigations found substance. And we reviewed the management corrective action plan, and management did apply various different mechanisms of employee correction in those investigations. There is one new allegation in the quarter that we have been investigating, and the outcome of that investigation will be reported in the next audit committee meeting, because I expect that by that time we would issue the report. So, kind of staying busy on the fraud side as well. As a reminder, our fraud investigations are also conducted by the same individuals that work under Mr. Middlebrooks. They conduct both operational audits as well as the fraud investigations for the authority. Next slide. Madam Chair, Mr. Greenwood, this concludes my briefing. Happy to answer additional questions.
Mr. Pond?
I have one more. When you identify, previous slide, you talked about a newly reported allegation where the supervisors approving time cards that were inappropriate, could be considered fraudulent, maybe not, but what is the follow-up action? Because that goes back to the supervisor. I know every case is different, but I just would like to hear maybe a little bit how we deal with, how managers are dealing with situations like falsifying time cards and that kind of thing.
Right. Okay. I'll be happy to answer this, and maybe a little bit generic because every case is different. But generally speaking, we would go through an investigation process if investigation is warranted. Once we're done with the investigation, we would sit down typically with the head of that business unit or department and with the AGM of HR or labor relations or both, depending on the circumstances. We'll walk them through the case before we give them a draft report. They have an opportunity to review the report, have a discussion with us, understand the circumstances, ask questions, and then we generally, from an audit perspective, we're not allowed to make recommendation as to the disciplinary action, if any, that should be applied to a particular employee or group of employees. That's up to the discretion of the management team. You know, that's their job effectively. We don't tell them go and do X, Y, and Z with that particular individual. But what we do is have a follow-up session, several weeks later to understand if anything and what has been done before we close the investigation. So I hope that answers your question. The amount of follow-up and discipline can be different depending on the severity of the case. And as you might remember, it could be something from coaching, education to, if something that's egregious, termination of employment, or if there's any violations of law, going to jail. I don't know if that answers the question.
And then
It does. You see things like that, and it happens in any organization. I think every organization has a culture, and to me, integrity is a huge part of the kind of culture you want in any organization. So just creating a culture where that's not allowed and there are consequences is, I think, important. And that was the point of my question.
So, Mr. Pine, if I can add to that, in this particular case, Mr. Zanov brought it to management's attention, including myself, and we started to look at it on a piecemeal. How did this error occur? Was it simply an error, or was there intent? There was further investigation into the level of communication that manager had with the employee, the employee's family. So it's a very detailed set of investigative procedures. And at the end of the day, if it was an error of omission, then we'll be looking at areas in our process that can be improved. In this particular case, managers are told, if you're unsure, escalate the issue, and you have counterparts in HR, plus you have your senior management. If there was intent behind it, then management will conclude that, and to your point, go a very different direction with the manager involved.
Mr. Floyd?
Yeah, just a comment. I didn't get a chance to thank the auditors, Brad and Catherine, for the work they do. But, when you sit on a board like this, competence in the financial information that we are provided is essential to being able to do the job that we're supposed to do here. And one way that you gain that confidence is through consistent audits that tell you that they're not doing anything wrong, that they're competent of that. And so first of all, I want to thank management for the attitude that they have about providing this information and making sure that it's right. I want to thank you, Emil, for making sure that what we're getting and what we're seeing and how that's going is competent. And I want to thank the auditors for the job that they do when they come in, because it's important as a board member to feel that the information you're getting is reliable, and it's correct, and that it's not trying to shape your opinion about one issue or the other. So anyway, thanks to you guys for the work that you all do in providing that information to you. One question is that this audit statement that I'm looking at here says draft on it. Is the audit statement ready to be presented to the board as a whole now?
I believe that's the case. We put it as a draft on purpose because we would like to review with the audit committee first before it's finally issued. And when it's issued, it will have a date, the formal signatures through DocuSign and all that stuff. But I don't want to speak with, we're ready to go.
Okay, and it will be presented to the board prior to the next board meeting, is that correct? In some sort of...
Well, we just read the findings at the board meeting like we normally do. I don't think there's another presentation there.
Oh, I mean, normally we get a copy of it somewhere that says final audit between now and then. Will that happen?
I think we will distribute the final report and put it on the website.
Okay.
I don't know if that's the intent of the question.
Okay, but
If you
I mean,
want
we're not
if you
waiting
want a
on-
copy, you're certainly welcome to one. Yeah. I know it's public. Public
you don't
information.
read this thing, Frida? I mean, I'm telling you.
I have already read it cover to cover.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm not there yet, so I don't want to read the draft and then have to go back and read the final report.
No, I don't
Checking for
anticipate any
changes.
changes to the information that you've been presented. And maybe I'm trying to bite too much, but part of my job should be to get to a point where you read the draft and that is it.
Okay.
We don't want to publish something that's different than what you have read.
Okay. All right. I think my questions have been answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Frierson?
Yes. I want to say thank you to your audit staff. I mean, this is a lot of deep diving that has to happen with these contracts. And the fact is, from my understanding, that you were able to discover that there was $750,000 worth of charges that were not allowable, that were reversed, if I'm understanding, speaks volume about what the auditors are looking at. And that's just because you looked at, 25 contracts?
Well, we finished 37, so this number relates to the 37 completed projects.
Okay, the 37.
The other ones we couldn't finish because, we have to do a good job too.
Yeah.
So it relates to the 37 projects.
Well, wonderful. And my hope is that, that as your staff begins to grow and supported in that, you'll be able to look at more contracts and be able to find some things like this.
Well, management's been very supportive of our staffing needs, and we try to be judicious in how much money we spend auditing stuff, because that's overhead, right?
Okay.
So we try to be very judicious of, we try to do the best we can with what we have. And my hope is that I never want to see a finding like I'm praying for a clean audit every time, but sometimes we find things.
Okay, well, great. Well, that's what we want to see, the deep dive, and so we appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Please relay back to your staff how much we appreciate all this hard work. We know that this takes countless hours of time, and we really do appreciate all the work they're doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
So next, we have a cybersecurity briefing by Dean Malice.
I just want to wish everyone happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Mr. Greenwood, members of the Audit Committee. You said my name's Dean Malice. I'm the AGM of Information Security, or Cybersecurity. Next slide, please. I thought we'd throw that term around, cybersecurity, so I thought it's important that we kind of just define it. So cybersecurity is understanding, managing, and mitigating the risks of our critical assets from being disclosed, altered, or denied access to. Next slide, please. Excuse me. I reported to this board that the TSA came out with a security directive in December of 2021. December 2021. It's the TSA Directive 1582-2101. They have just come out with an addendum to it at the end of October, where they've added some more items to it. This will be an iterative process with them, so I would imagine next year they'll add some more items, but the items that we initially were targeted to meet was to designate a cybersecurity coordinator. That has been done. That is me and my director. Report cybersecurity incidents to CISA within 24 hours. That's the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency. Develop and implement a cybersecurity incident response plan, which we have, and complete a cybersecurity vulnerability assessment to identify potential gaps or vulnerabilities, which we have done. TSA came on site on November 9th to do an inspection. No significant items came out of that inspection. And I'm anticipating they'll send us a letter to that effect. They don't have a formal documentation yet, but that is what I assume that they're going to do. They'll come out again next year, most likely, to look at the additional items that they've added. Those additional items, as we bake through them, we're pretty much on track to meet those as well. So I don't see any concerns there. I'll report those to the board in the next audit committee meeting sometime in the spring. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So every year, just like the holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, PCI compliance we have to do. That's the payment card industry. They audit us to make sure that we are compliant on cybersecurity things so that we can continue to take credit card payments. We have passed that this year. The process will start again in May. We did National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, where we had 4 lunch and learns. We also kicked off our annual cybersecurity awareness training. I mentioned phishing because in that month we saw a 4% decline in people clicking on links. We do monthly tests, phishing tests. One of the other items that we are deploying from a email protection perspective, the product that we use scans all of the links that you might get from an external email that comes in. But if, let's say, Emil sends me an email with a link to a website, it wasn't part of the package to scan that. We've implemented that now, so those start getting tracked as well. Our advanced endpoint protection is now completed. One of the other items that we procured was malicious domain blocking and enhancement. One of the things that we've rolled out, and we're starting to do that phase now, is putting agents on the endpoint that will monitor and block sites when people are off-site. The product works when devices are connected to the MARTA network, but when people are working from home, we weren't getting that protection. But now with these agents out there, we will be getting that protection, and then in the future, we'll also start blocking those sites where we don't want employees going to. As Emil mentioned, we've done some penetration tests. We're going to be doing new ones this year. One of the ones that we're doing is on the new trains that are coming in. So the first, it's actually a 4-year project. As the trains come in, we're doing a preliminary design review on the infrastructure on those trains. We've hired a vendor to analyze that, and it's going to go through iterative steps. So we're going to do a medium and then a final design review, and then when the trains get delivered, we're going to do a penetration test on that train. The other thing in coming around probably the February time frame is we're going to do another enterprise penetration test, and we're going to focus on our cloud infrastructure in that penetration test. And that concludes my presentation. Next slide. Should have that. Thank you.
Any questions? Well, once again, we appreciate everything your staff's doing because it's very vital to what we need at MARTA, so thank you.
You're welcome, and everyone enjoy your Thanksgiving as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other matters that need to come before the audit committee today? If not, we are adjourned. Everyone have a great Thanksgiving.